This presentation was brought to you by Ashton Brayman, Blake Richmond, and Ben Cummings. The foundation of the American rights we have today would not be possible without several key figures during a time period called the Enlightenment. Starting in 1685, the Enlightenment was a time period where philosophers began to question the traditional views of the world and turned now to science and reason. One such was Voltaire, an agent of change. He was a French philosopher known for his anti-traditionalist views. Unlike most, Voltaire was a critic of Christianity at the time. He believed that all men were entitled to two basic human rights, the freedom of religion and freedom of speech. These two core values of Voltaire heavily influenced the rights held in the First Amendment of our U.S. Constitution. He believed in reason and tolerance rather than old views of the authority of the king and the Catholic Church. He also believed that these views should be questioned. Voltaire playfully used the figure of Jesus to tell people about his deist views and believed that Christians were intolerant, being brainwashed by the Catholic Church over the Dark Age period. He lived and heavily influenced King Frederick II of Prussia, who became one of the first enlightened kings. Arguably one of his most famous remarks, Voltaire once said, "I may not agree with what you say, but I will fight to the death for you to say it." This leads us to Charlie Kirk. Kirk was a conservative political activist who created Turning Point USA, a non-profit organization that encourages the spread of his several Christian American ideals. He believed in several of the First Amendment values of free speech that were influenced by Voltaire. Kirk would visit several different colleges across the nation and create a Prove Me Wrong booth, where we would have different religious, political, and philosophical debates with college students. He was a strong believer of this open debate. He was also a very pro-supporter of Donald Trump, and his debates arguably helped Trump win the 2024 election by appealing to the young vote. However, on September 10th, 2025, Charlie Kirk attended what was probably seen as just a normal Prove Me Wrong rally in Utah Valley University. Like usual, he just debated college students. While debating a student about gang violence, Kirk was suddenly shot in the neck and fell to the ground. He died from these injuries shortly after. Kirk was only 31 years old and left behind a wife and two young daughters. Kirk's assassination left shockwaves across the entire nation. A man who had spent his whole life standing up for his beliefs and free speech was killed. In many ways, Charlie Kirk became the living example of Voltaire's famous quote, not agreeing with what his adversary said, but ultimately fought for the death for their right to say it and debate. Many condemned the violence. However, others openly mocked Charlie Kirk's death online. Most times, these people were silenced for their crude words, many of them being fired from their jobs. However, the First Amendment did protect their right to mock Charlie Kirk's death. Media, like South Park, had an episode released a month before the assassination that made fun of Charlie Kirk. This episode was pulled off the air after the assassination. Also, Jimmy Kimmel's late night show was suspended as a result of Kimmel making a controversial statement where he said,
Some new lows over the weekend with the MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them and doing everything they can to score political points.
So now there was a crisis. The same people who supported Charlie Kirk and others to have free speech and debate were now silencing those who made controversial statements about Kirk's death. This had led to a polarizing divide. The left called the censoring of Jimmy Kimmel and other actions as hypocritical, while the right claims those who supported the assassination of Kirk was supporting hate speech. As a result, the very meaning of free speech in America is now up to question. Who knows what the long-term effects Charlie Kirk's death will have on free speech. But the increase of censorship of ideas that are controversial is definitely a possibility. Charlie Kirk and Voltaire were similar in many different ways. Both were massive supporters in the freedom of speech during times where being allowed to criticize everyone and everything was controversial. If Voltaire was still alive today, I'm sure he would have applauded Charlie Kirk's efforts in supporting the First Amendment and fighting to the death for people's free speech, while also letting someone who supported Charlie Kirk's death not to be silenced, protecting their rights. Whether you love him or hate him, there's no denying that Charlie Kirk had a heavy impact on today's society. Like previously stated, Trump may have not won the election in 2024 if it wasn't for him. Kirk has influenced millions of young voters, and the death of Charlie Kirk led to even further influence as more and more people became closer to God. Charlie Kirk is a change agent. In some ways, it's almost symbolic that Charlie Kirk stood up for many of the same beliefs as Voltaire, not agreeing with what others said, but fighting to the very last breath when the bullet hit his neck for people who agreed with him, opponents who called him slurs, and all of the above, to give their right to say what they wanted, even if it was wrong or hateful.